Thanks, Rob. Always appreciate you leading us in prayer. Very thoughtful, and yeah, I always find it stimulating. Reminds me of different things that are on our hearts. Thank you so much for that, and great to hear from you too, Matt. And I know a bunch of us, we're really excited about what's going to be happening in our Next Gen ministry. It's a wonderful time to be a part of things in that space. Innes Fitzgerald is a 16-year-old cross-country runner from Devon in England. Like every young person, Innes has dreams. When I started running, she says, the prospect of me competing in the World Cross Country Championships would have seemed merely a dream. But Innes is now Britain's leading junior female endurance athlete, and recently she came fourth at the European Under-20 Cross-Country Championships, which is an amazing achievement when you're competing against people who are 3 years older than you and do so well. But after the championship, she hit the headlines for her unusual mode of travel. The road and rail trip from her home near Exeter in Devon to Turin in Italy took more than 20 hours. A coach to Lille in France, a train trip from Paris to Italy. She and her family rode fold-up bikes in between. You see, Fitzgerald is a passionate environmental advocate. Aviation is the most energy-intense activity we can do. It explodes a person's carbon footprint, she says. I don't want that on my conscience. In fact, she's recently written to the UK Athletics to ask not to be considered for the team for the World Cross Country Championships in Australia. It was actually yesterday or the day before in New South Wales. She says, the reality of the travel fills me with deep concern. Now, I'm not sure whether you agree with her environmental position or not, but I have to say that I admire her. I admire someone who's so passionate, so completely committed to what she believes. You may recall the documentary from 2006 called An Inconvenient Truth about how former US Vice President Al Gore's campaign to educate people about global warming. Again, like with Fitzgerald, some agreed, some disagreed, but what I remember of it was the countless jokes that were told about getting a lecture from Al Gore as he departed on a private jet. But this young lady, she lives what she says. She prepared to sacrifice dreams and opportunities for what she believes in, picked for a world championships, but chooses not to go because of what she believes. Can you imagine doing that? Can you imagine doing that? I mean, I know what it's like to be a long-distance training person, and I know what it must be like to be in the UK. Getting up at 5 a.m, running in an English winter, slogging through the mist, the mud, the biting wind, day after day after day, training to be the best, and then saying no to the opportunity. No, because you believe in something so deeply, so completely, that it drives you to leave a great opportunity behind, to sacrifice it. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine? I admire this young lady too because of her commitment to an ideal that changes her life in a real way. In a similar way, I have to say that I've admired people throughout Christian history who not only have read or understood or known who God is, but it has changed their lives dramatically. Not only characters in the Bible, but characters throughout church history. You read a book like Fox's Book of Martyrs. It inspires and challenges. I remember as a teenager, a later teenager, reading a biography about one pastor who was jailed for years in a communist country with nothing, day after day. Isn't that admirable? Wow, just amazing to see what they do. And then you read about some of the other things that have happened in recent times. A number of years ago, I worked with a couple who were related to an Australian missionary by the name of Graham Staines. Graham and two of his children, Philip and Timothy, were burnt to death in India. And I recall how his wife, Gloria, offered forgiveness to the assailants. I admire. Can you imagine being so committed that was your course of action. That's no strings faith, isn't it? How do you respond when you read accounts of that expressions of faith in the Bible? For example, when Peter boldly steps out of the boat onto the water when Jesus calls him. Can you imagine having the courage to take a step out of that boat? Or how about Mary of Bethany, when she cracks open a bottle of perfume worth a year's wages and pours it over Jesus' head? Can you imagine feeling so overwhelmed with love that it seems like it's no sacrifice, a year's wages? Can you imagine? Or what about when you hear this testimony from the Apostle Paul? He says, I know I sound like a madman, but I've served Jesus far more. I've worked harder, put in prison more often, whipped more times without number, faced death again and again. 5 times he talks about being whipped. 3 times beaten with rods. Once I was stoned, not on drugs. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Once I spent a whole night and day adrift at sea. Travelled many long journeys. Danger from rivers, from robbers. I was trying to think if there might be some other alliteration with an R there as well. Faced danger from my own people, the Jews as well as the Gentiles. Danger in the cities, in the deserts, on the seas. Danger from men who claim to be believers and are not. Worked hard and long, endured sleepless nights, hungry, thirsty, without food, shivered in the cold. Can you imagine having such conviction that you risk your life like that? Can you imagine? I want to play a little word game with you. We're going to play a little word game today, but you don't have to respond. I know, we don't want to yell things out and all that sort of stuff, okay, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to put a word up on the screen. It's going to be a table because I'm an organised person. I want you to think about what the opposite of this word might be, okay? So the first word is risk. Rob, you might need your glasses on. I think it's a little bit small there on the screen. Today we're sponsored by OPSM. Risk. What about the second word here? Luke. Warm. The third word. Passionate. The fourth word. Humdrum. The fifth word. Vibrant. You can see I spent some time on Google this week, stretching my imagination. What do you think the opposites are? What's the opposite of risk? Well, someone's actually calling out. That's impressive. You can come up with some great words. I'm going to tell you what Google came up with for me, okay? So risk and safe. Lukewarm and extremes. Passionate. Now, I love this one. What's the opposite of passionate? Indifferent. Now, I remember hearing someone once talk about that the opposite of love is not hate, the opposite of love is indifference. Humdrum, exciting. Vibrant, listless. When you read that list, how do you think about your faith? What category does it fit into? Do you wistfully surmise, I want to move beyond the bland cliche of humdrum faith? I see some of those words on the screen, and when I look at myself in the mirror, when I ask myself those questions, am I where? Or maybe you even ask, what is it that makes faith come fully alive? What's the difference between bland and something that is full of flavour? What is it that motivates? What is it that changes? What brings a revelation? What brings motivation? What brings heart and energy? Sometimes we think of words like duty. We think of accountability. They're great words, but they tend to only work when someone holds something over your head. I've got a performance review, therefore I better act a certain way or I better do something. The way they're motivated, I was always told that the way that some teachers choose to motivate students is, you know what, you've got an exam at the end of the year. It's kind of holding something over someone's head. What is it that really motivates for a faith that's fully alive? Ultimately, it's love, isn't it, that brings a change. Not second-rate motivators. In fact, living a life filled with banal, listless, indifferent faith is actually an assault, an affront to God, isn't it? John wrote these words. He says, I know all the things that you do, that you're neither hot nor cold. I wish that you were one or the other, but because you're lukewarm, I want to spit you out of my mouth. The reason why indifference like that is so offensive to God is because it's essentially a form of idolatry. It's essentially a form of idolatry because it says other things in my life are more important than God. That's what it says. I'm indifferent to God. I care about other things more. They are my gods. I care about my family. I care about my career. I care about my bank balance, my whatever it might be. They are our gods if they come before God. They are our idols. But I want to say something else today, not focus in a sense on that particular idea. Because humdrum, banal faith is not only an affront to God, it's also degenerating to the person who lives it. Have you noticed in life that half-baked anything is not enjoyable? You know what I mean? Something which is just mediocre. I remember when I was a kid, they used to have these biscuits, Arnott's biscuits, called Nice biscuits. I'm probably not even saying it right. It's probably meant to be French, Nice biscuits or something like that. Nice is almost like a half-baked word, isn't it? You know? Yeah. Something with things that are half-baked leaves us kind of, And I want to say that living a half-baked faith is not only an assault on God, it's degenerating to each of us. Because it leaves us, It leaves us living between two worlds, fully satisfying myself and just doing whatever I want, or completely living for God. And we live somewhere in that middle, stranded between those two worlds, going through the motions, living a faith that's not really knowing what it is to trust in Jesus, not really knowing what it is to see Jesus work in real ways. Do you ever ask yourself, if you find yourself in that space, asking why that happens? Asking why I'm not living full-on sold out for Jesus? Look, I've been a follower of Jesus for more than 40 years now. And in times in my journey, it's been For me, when I reflect, I think of two main problems for myself. Firstly, I think of fear. I'm a risk taker in life to a point. I'm a risk taker in the sense that I like to calculate and then go for something. In faith, sometimes I'm too calculating. And I get held up by some fear. Can you relate to that? Times when you need to make some sort of decision in life. Do I follow Jesus or not? And I'm doing some sort of calculation, however you might go about this process. This is what I, in a sense, know I should do. But here's the fear elements. I fear rejection. I fear being shunned by some friends or family. Maybe being isolated at work. Maybe a fear about, can I really do this? Will God really come through? Maybe it's that moment where you're faced with some sort of bold step. Do I think about it, or in a sense, do I overthink about it? Which one are you? How does it impact your journey of faith? Sometimes for me, fear gets in the way. Other times, it's not fear, it's pride. Pride which says simply, this says, you know what, I can just do it myself. I don't need any help. I'm quite competent. I can do A, B, and C. I've got lots of resources. Away we go. The irony is that following on from that verse which John writes about being lukewarm, he writes these words. He says, you say I am rich. I have everything I want. And this next phrase is so critical, isn't it? I don't need a thing. That's an incredible expression of pride. I don't need a thing. It says, I can do everything myself. And if you live like that, when I live like that, we never know, we never experience a difference that God has made. It's almost like we cannot point to something and say, God actually answered this prayer. God did this in my life at this particular point in time. Because you know what? I don't depend on God. In a sense, I have become God. Can you identify things in your life? Can you? That might get in the way for you being sold out. For me, it's fear or pride. Maybe for you, it's something different. Or maybe I even want to ask you the question, do you want for more than that? Actually want for more. Because how do we make some sense of change in our spiritual journey? If we are dissatisfied, we live in this space between the two worlds with just a faith. For some people, I know. For some people, there are people who are, I'm 100% doing something or I'm 0% doing something. You know what I mean? I'm sure you've seen people like that. They kind of live extreme lives. I kind of think that the Apostle Paul is one of those characters, you know? Like he's 100% against Christians. He's 100% working for Jesus. You know what I mean? Like they live in extreme places, but for the most of us, we don't live in that extreme situation. We live somewhere in the middle, don't we? That's the reality for most of us for where we're doing. And so most of us, I suspect, are a little bit like myself and we're calculating. And understand, Jesus tells people to calculate. Jesus tells people to assess. Don't begin. He's talking about coming to follow Jesus. He's talking about this to people who are going to go on this journey with him. Don't begin until you count the cost. And then he gives a story about who builds a building without kind of working out whether you've got the resources to complete it. He says that you should think about it, but there's something more in it than just thinking about it. See, ultimately, I think what it comes down to is this, is do I, or am I even, able to trust God in my life? So in those big decision times, in the daily events in our workplaces, our relationships, am I able to trust God in all I do? That's what kind of, I think, is the thing that frees us up to be fully passionate and committed to Jesus. Think about how trust grows in life. Oh, sorry. Think about how trust grows in life. I was reflecting on two situations in life where trust is central to those relationships. The easiest one, I think, for all of us to find and think about is because it involves all of us, is a parent-child relationship. So if you think about the parent-child relationship, because a child, when it's born, is completely dependent on the parent. It's completely dependent on the parent, and in fact doesn't know anything different than to trust the parent. The parent's the one who provides everything for life. And so it starts out high. Then you think about, how does a parent start to break trust with a child? Isn't one event that breaks trust? I suspect that it's more like multiple events. I think that in that sort of relationship, that trust is chipped away. Kind of like you get out the axe and you've got a tree to knock down. It takes multiple blows to start to knock the tree down, doesn't it? Kind of each swing of the axe takes a little bit more out of it. Another swing, a little bit more, another swing, another swing, another swing, until eventually timber falls over. I think parents weaken trust one blow at a time. Trust starts high but is chipped away. Compare that with how trust is established in, say, a romantic relationship. Trust kind of starts low in a romantic relationship. There's no history, so trust is kind of minimal. It may be aspirational, but it's minimal. There's a reason why when a couple first starts dating, they dress up physically and emotionally, want to show their best side, because there's minimal amount of trust. In fact, sometimes you'll hear people talk about, I knew that our relationship was going somewhere when they saw me at my worst. But no one in a romantic relationship shows your worst at first, do you? Because you're trying to kind of build up something. As a couple starts to date regularly, they test the waters of trust. I'll let them see this part of me. Will they accept or reject it? Show them a little bit more. Open up and share some of my fears. Maybe trust a little bit more. Tell them about some of my hopes and dreams. Try to build trust a little bit more. Step by step in relationships, romantic relationships, we try to build trust. It's not a tree being struck with an axe. I think of it kind of like a broken arm being fixed by a plaster cast. You know, when you're making a plaster cast, you kind of, you wrap the broken arm in a soft bandage and then add layer upon layer of more bandages soaked in the casting material, don't you? And the more layers that you add to it, the stronger it becomes. And so step by step, it strengthens and adds trust. I think our trust in God doesn't start at 100% and then it's chipped away. It begins with a first layer, a first step of trust, and then there's more steps of trust taken, more steps of faith like bandages added to the plaster cast that make it stronger and stronger. What first steps, what increases of trust do you experience in your life? You know, one of the most powerful verses in the Bible talking about how we do this daily is in Romans chapter 12. And at the start of it, Paul writes these words. He says, give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. So this is, in a sense, an ultimate step of trust. Give everything that you have to God. He says, let them be a living and holy sacrifice. He's saying, don't be half-hearted, give everything you have. But there's a problem with that verse, a struggle with that verse as you read it, and it's this. It says that you would offer your body as a living sacrifice. See, sacrifices traditionally were some form of animal that was slaughtered and then put onto an altar. It gave up its life completely for the sacrifice. The problem with living sacrifices like you and like me is that we can go on the altar, but we can also jump off. You know what I'm talking about? To say, yes, God, I offer myself to you today. Then tomorrow, it's a bit harder, I'm just jumping off. You see what I mean? In fact, I have to say personally, I think for myself, it would be much easier to make one grand, noble gesture of sacrificial life and die than to make a daily sacrifice. Daily, in my mind, is much harder than a once-off because daily means today. It means this afternoon. It means tomorrow. It means at lunchtime when I'm feeling grumpy. It means tomorrow afternoon when someone cuts me off in traffic and I feel, It means a different time when you can imagine what your story would be, can't you? But I want to say to you, if you want to live a life that is fully alive, a faith that is not listless, but a faith that is vibrant, a faith that is passionate, a faith that is committed, it actually needs to start with little steps. Little steps to build it stronger and stronger. To be a living daily sacrifice is what makes the difference. The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu was famous for his saying that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. I personally prefer the children's riddle. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do you grow a passionate, alive, fully alive faith? One step at a time. One step at a time. What might that look like? For me, when I think of this, I think about those little steps. I think a step is the first thing in my day. For me, it means I need to begin with God, to have stillness, stillness to listen, stillness to ask, stillness to seek God. Begin first in my day. First in my thinking. When I look at the world, I want to see it through the eyes of Jesus first. I know it was a cliche from a while ago, but the little phrase, what would Jesus do, is not such a bad phrase to think about. When I make a decision, see it through the eyes of Jesus. When I meet a person, see them through the eyes of Jesus. First in my thinking, first in my relationships with my loved ones, with my friends, with my acquaintances. How does Jesus impact each of those? First in my resources, in my time, in my energy, in my money. I mean, when I ask myself this question, what difference does it actually make to my life being a follower of Jesus? What difference does it make to my timetable, to the way in which I spend all of my time, to the way in which I invest my heart, to the way in which I invest my money? First in my resources. To be a fully sold out, completely passionate follower of Jesus. Small steps, first steps. You know, I think they're pretty decent. I don't think they're revolutionary. Bits of advice, those steps. But what I think ultimately they're about, in fact, is actually about encountering God. You see, because as much as they are practical steps, what I mentioned before is what ultimately motivates us is love. Love is the greatest internal motivator. Love is the thing that will ultimately change your life. And as much as I list those 4 practical steps there, I want to say to you that those 4 steps are about this one thing, about encountering God. That's what they're all about. Encountering God. See, that's the thing that always changes lives. It changed the lives of Peter, changed the life of Mary, changed the life of Paul, an encounter with God. That's what will change it. That's what moves from faith to sold out faith. Encountering. In Psalm 63, the psalmist writes these beautiful words. He says, "O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water." Could that be your prayer today? It's the prayer of the psalmist who's calling out to God saying, I want to know you. I want to encounter you. I want you to revolutionize my life. The promise is always the same promise that Jesus gives about if you ask, if you seek God, he will respond. That's the thing that you can hold in that process of seeking. You can hold it tight. You see, first steps are about encountering God. about learning to trust God, to know Him. So let me ask you very simply today, where do you think your faith sits? If you were writing a table of words to describe your faith, what sort of words would you use? Would you use words like risk, passionate, or would you use words like listless, indifferent? Where do you want to end up? Do you want a faith that doesn't just play games and doesn't settle for mediocrity? I want to ask you today to respond. And so in a moment I'm actually going to pray, and what I'm asking you is very simply, if you want to go to a more committed faith, I'm asking you to seek to encounter Jesus. Whatever form that might be. For some it might be learning to take little steps each day, and in those learning to trust a bit more. Some of you, it might just be, okay, I want to spend some particular time. I want to grab a hold of the February challenge stuff and utilise that each day. For some, it might be a revolution's required in how you look at your relationships, to see them through the eyes of Jesus. For some, it might mean a change in the way in which you use your resources in life. Little steps that allowed you to build trust. And for some, it may mean getting down on our knees and pleading. Oh God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. Can you imagine what it's like? Can you imagine what it's like to live a sold-out faith? Completely committed in all you do. Let's pray together, shall we? I might ask you to bow your head, and even if you're home in your own environment there, I'm just going to ask you very simply today to respond. If you feel like there's a step that you want to take, a prayer that you need to make, just going to ask you very simply to raise your hand. That's all. I'm not asking you to publicly come up the front, but just if you know that my faith requires something more, to move to a different place. Just ask you just to raise your hand. It's kind of an expression of what's happening in your own heart and mind. And as I pray, you would love to invite you just to join along. For our God, we thank you that you are a God who is completely loving, and that we can experience that love in a way that completely changes our life. God, forgive us when we've lived in different ways to you. Maybe fears grabbed a hold of our heart. Our pride overrules our dependence on you. And we need to learn to trust in you. So God, I pray for each one of us here today, that we could just live in a more sold out way for you. Help us to take little steps each day. Help us to seek you so that love would motivate us. In the name of Jesus, we pray.